Psalm 53 we come to today, the 53rd Psalm. If you were with us in the Psalm series a year and a half or two ago at Buena Park, this will sound very, very familiar because this psalm is almost word for word the same as Psalm 14. But there are a few differences that we'll talk about. So before we get into our outline, let's read together the psalm, Psalm 53. For the choir director, according to Mahalath, a maskil of David. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt and have committed abominable injustice. There is no one who does good. God has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see if there is anyone who understands, who seeks after God. Every one of them has turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Have the workers of wickedness no knowledge, who eat up my people as though they ate bread and have not called upon God? There they were in great fear where no fear had been, for God scattered the bones of him who encamped against you. You put them to shame, because God had rejected them. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. When God restores his captive people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. I entitled this, your handout, the title of the psalm on your handout, How Can They Not Know? There's a question asked in verse 4, don't they know? And the implied answer is, yes, they do. Despite what they say, they do. Well, let's introduce the psalm, talk about the setting firstly. The author of this psalm is David. We're told that in the superscription, that it is a maskil of David. That term maskil indicates that it is a song for perhaps for instruction or perhaps a song that's to be skillfully played. But there are, from Psalm 51 to Psalm 70, there's about 20 psalms that are all by David, with the exception of maybe one. As far as the background, we have to sort of look behind the leaves to see what's going on. There are some comments made in the psalm that suggest what's happening. It suggests that there's some period of international intrigue where enemy nations have threatened the realm. And you say, well, now where do you get that? Well, mostly you get hints of that in verse 4 and in verse 6. In verse 6, for instance, oh, that salvation, the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. All right, so that means that this is written when there's a tabernacle or a temple in Jerusalem. God is dwelling there, and they need help. They need God to come and bring them deliverance. It implies there are enemies who have come against them, who are doing great damage. Verse 4 calls these enemies the workers of wickedness, and that they are eating up God's people like a meal. That's the language of attack and battle. So in your notes there, the reference to God's dwelling in Zion, the reference to God's dwelling in Zion means that what's the event behind this psalm has to be from 1003 or later. What happened in 1003? Well, I tell you right there. I can't tease you too much with that. That's when David moved his capital from Hebron to Jerusalem, and he established the tabernacle, and God began to dwell at Zion. Yes, Jerry.
You suppose, is this talking about, I think that's what you just said, it's like an international persecution?
I think so, yeah.
Not within the country itself.
Right. I don't think these are internal enemies. These seem to be external enemies who are in some way threatening the realm. Usually in the Bible, when this language of, when he talks about God looks down from heaven on the sons of men, it's not just looking down upon the Israelites, it's upon looking at all humanity. That these are hostile pagan people who are being indicted here. The books of Samuel record for us a lot of different wars that David was involved in after he was king. It's impossible to know specifically which one it is, and I think he's left it intentionally vague so that later kings and people could sing this and draw encouragement from it as well. This psalm is placed, see letter C, the placement of the psalm, it's placed around others which are focusing on sin and judgment. The previous 4 psalms have all been about judgment. So like Psalm 50 is Asaph, who was one of David's worship leaders, writes this long poem condemning Israel for violating the covenant. And then Psalm 51, David has been confronted about his sin with Bathsheba, and he confesses it. Psalm 52, which we looked at last week, was about Doeg the Edomite, who was this wicked, proud man, and he's indicted, he's convicted. And now here is another kind of person who is indicted, convicted. The godless fool is confronted in Psalm 53. The previous psalm, Psalm 52, announced an indictment against the wicked, whereas Psalm 53 reveals that there are people who don't think there is anything like divine accountability. They don't believe that God is going to hold anyone accountable. So this psalm is about, in part, the idea that there is accountability, that God is going to, there's divine accountability, and that there are people who say, no, there isn't, and we can do what we want. Psalm 52 says there are people who are committed to doing evil. Psalm 53 takes it further and says that nobody is really committed to doing what's good. So there are 4 psalms in a row that all focus on the problem of sin. Some of them are the sins of Israel. Some of them are the sins of the Gentiles. This one is focusing mostly upon the Gentiles. Go to the second page in your handout, and I'll say something else about this. This psalm is almost an exact copy of Psalm 14. In fact, I think we're going to turn back there in a moment, and you'll see it is very, very different. I mean, very, very similar. There wasn't enough caffeine in that water there. Turn back to Psalm 14 and see if this sounds familiar. For the choir director, a psalm of David. So the heading's a little different, but the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. The Lord has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Do all the workers of wickedness not know, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call upon the Lord? There they are in great dread, for God is with the righteous generation. You would put to shame the counsel of the afflicted, but the Lord is his refuge. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores his captive people, Jacob will rejoice, Israel will be glad. That's not exactly the same, but it's probably 90% the same. It's very close. So look at your handout. There are some differences. The key differences include that there's a longer heading in Psalm 53, the psalm we're looking at today. A big difference is that in Psalm 53, the title that is used most often is God, as opposed to the Lord, or Yahweh, is used in Psalm 14. Maybe you remember this, but the Psalms are broken up into 5 books. And we are now at Psalm 53, we're in what's called the second book. And one thing about the second book is most of these Psalms use the title God instead of Yahweh. So that's one difference. In Psalm 14, the name Yahweh is used 3 times. Here in Psalm 53, the title God is used only. That's the only one that's used. Another thing, number 3, is that Psalm 53, verse 5, is a little bit longer than the verse that it corresponds to in Psalm 14. But then Psalm 14 has an extra verse. So that's different. And the difference is mostly in this announcement of judgment. The judgment that's announced here in Psalm 53, verse 5, is more harsh than the one back in Psalm 14. So now if you were to take both Psalms and print them out in English, like use the New American Standard, here's Psalm 14, and here's Psalm 53, it might even look like there are more differences, but the Hebrew text is actually closer than the New American Standard is. Yes?
I'm just curious, were they written any time during the same time? Or?
One of them, probably what it is that one is original and the other is an adaptation. In fact, I mentioned this in letter C. The duplication of this psalm could suggest that maybe this is a song that was used frequently in worship, and maybe that there were different settings for it or different times to sing different versions of it. Our hymnals in the chapel, there are some songs that are included twice. In fact, this morning I'm singing an offertory, "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross." There are at least 2 versions of that in our hymnal. And in the hymnal I'm singing it out of, there were actually 3 versions of it. Sometimes exactly the same words with different tunes. Sometimes the words are edited a little bit. So songs that are used more frequently tend to have different versions of them. And that seems to be what's going on with this one. Back up to letter B, I mentioned that if you compared the English of these psalms, it may even look like there's more differences, but there really aren't. Like at the end of the psalm, here in Psalm 53, verse 6, "Let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad." Psalm 14 in the New American Standard says, "Jacob will rejoice, Israel will be glad." But the Hebrew text is the same. I don't know why the same translation translates the same phrase differently, other than the different committee members were probably working on different parts of it. But I think the fact that this is a twice-told song, that is, it shows up more than once. By the way, there's some other parts in the Psalms that do this. "Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in holy array." That's found early in the Psalms and shows up again later in the Psalms. So there are some songs that seem to have been used with greater frequency that have different versions of them within it. Psalm 18, a long 50 verses, is also found in its entirety in 2 Samuel 22. So a song that was quite memorable.
It's too good not to keep it.
That's right.
Or not to share it more.
That's right, yes. And, the headings are different, so it may be that this one had a different tune or had different arrangements. So this one is called a maskil, which could mean it's a song that gives instruction. It's a word for wisdom. So it either means that it gives wisdom or that it requires skill, a wise player, that you put your best musicians on it. So it may be that the arrangement for Psalm 53 was more complex. It's hard to say. All right, let's talk about what kind of psalm this is. This is a pretty unusual kind of psalm. If I were to ask you, what sort of psalm is it? Well, it's definitely not a praise psalm. It's not a song of thanks. It's not a, well, it is and it isn't. Like verse 6 does sound a little, "Oh, that salvation would come out of Zion." See, that's pleading. "Oh, Lord, we're in trouble. We need your help." Verse 6 does sound like a lament. But the stuff before it, it's hard. In fact, some of the Psalms right around here are hard to fit into the normal categories. Psalm 50, the one we saw last week, Psalm 52, they don't neatly fit into the 10 or 12 different groupings that most Psalms fit into. So, again, number 1 at the bottom, the last verse, verse 6, is a lament, but most of the verses before that are an indictment. It's like a prophet preaching against people. We do learn things from this. It is instructive, but it's not set out as some kind of teaching in a particular way. So there is a prophetic element. If you turn the page to page 3, when I talk about this psalm being prophetic, I don't mean that it's prophesying anything about the future. It's not futuristic prophecy, but it's an inspired analysis of the world. An inspired analysis of the world. In that sense, it's prophetic. You know, it's like in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Joshua is one of the books of the prophets. A book of the prophets, and so is Samuel and Kings. Prophets? Yes, because they're giving an inspired analysis on what happened in Israel's history. Not so much foretelling the future, but giving God's perspective on the way things are, or the way things have been. And that's what this psalm is doing. It's an indictment. This is the problem with the world. This is why these nations are doing what they're doing. They are corrupt, and they think they're going to get away with it. Most of the psalm, letter C, most of the psalm contains David's meditation on the foolishness and the godlessness of the enemies of the nation. The fool, mentioned in verse 1, the fool has said in his heart, is not any particular person. It's a kind of person. There's a kind of person that thinks this way. So if we go down to the structure, how do we break up this psalm? There's two parts. The first 5 verses are what we'd call a prophetic meditation. Meditating on why do wicked people do what they do? Why are they so bad? And then the last verse is a lament that pleads with God for help. And that meditation, verses 1 to 5, has 2 parts itself. It starts off with an indictment of the wicked, and then there's an announcement of judgment. I'm going to take a little sidebar here. When the prophets preach, there's basically 4 kinds of preaching that they do. There's indictment prophecies where they say, "Can you guys, are you out of your minds? Do you see what you're doing? Who told you I want you to go through all these rituals? What I want from you is your heart." So when Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel are confronting the nation, that's indictment. That's like what we have here in the beginning of Psalm 14. And then the prophets have messages of judgment. You're not only guilty, but judgment is going to come on you, either in the short term or the long term. And we have that here in Psalm 53. Another kind of a prophecy that they'll give is instruction. Here's what God wants instead. What does the Lord your God require of you, O man, but to seek justice, to walk humbly with your God? This is what you ought to be doing instead. Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are as scarlet, they'll be as white as snow. Come to me. That's instruction. And the last kind of prophecy you find in the Old Testament are prophecies of restoration. After the judgment is done, glory is going to come. Those are 4, almost anything you read in the prophets will fit. Daniel's a little harder because Daniel's kind of a unique prophet, but most of the prophets, most of what they say will fit into one of those 4 things. Here in this poem, in Psalm 53, we have 2 of those kinds of prophetic words. An indictment, 4 verses of this is what's wrong with the world. And then verse 5, this is the judgment that's going to come. And then it ends again with a lament. And as we read this meditation about the wicked, we find out that there are godless people who are actively oppressing the nation of Israel in David's day that led to the writing of this poem. Now let me say some notes of application before we get into the outline, the visual outline. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. It sounds like, at first, what's being talked about is atheism. I don't believe God exists at all. Now, one thing that's interesting is that in David's day, almost nobody was an actual atheist. Philosophical atheism, the thought-out idea that there really isn't a God, that this all that really didn't come into play, wasn't very popular until in the Greek world several centuries later. But what was more commonly believed was that the gods were not involved. There may be gods, but they're not here. They're not involved. They don't care, or they're not going to do anything. And because of that, I think what this psalm is going after, and the same thing for Psalm 14, is that this is a description of a practical atheist. A practical atheist. And what we mean by that is this is someone who lives as if there is no God. They might agree that in theory, there is a God there, but he's not going to do anything. And I'll show you where this language is used in the Psalms, and I think it's quite clear. Turn back to Psalm 10. Psalm 10. This is a lament about the wicked who are oppressing God's people. Psalm 10, why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In pride, the wicked hotly pursue the afflicted. Let them be caught in the plots which they've devised. For the wicked boasts of his heart's desire, and the greedy man curses and spurns the Lord. The wicked, in the haughtiness of his countenance, does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there is no God. So there's that same sort of statement. Now, look down at verse 11. The same wicked man who says there is no God also says, he says to himself, God has forgotten, he has hidden his face, he will never see it. So in that verse, the wicked man acknowledges that there is a God, but he's not going to do anything. So this expression, there is no God, the expression, if you attached something else to it, okay, let's give me an example. Let's say you're at an event. Maybe you're at a concert. Maybe you're at some place, and your wife lost her keys. And she says, can you go to the lost and found? And you're looking all around for keys, no keys here, no keys there. And you go to lost and found, and you pull out your phone and say, there are no keys here. No keys. Well, when I say that, that doesn't mean there's no keys anywhere, that keys don't exist. What I'm saying is, here, in this place, there are no keys. So the term for there is no is used in context like that. There's no one here like that. So for that reason, some people have translated this phrase, God is not here. God is not here. As opposed to the idea that God doesn't exist. Now, let me say, it is a foolish idea to think that there is no God at all, that God, in terms of his substance, doesn't exist. That is folly. But the kind of folly being addressed here is the thing that there's no God here to worry about. Yes?
I was going to say, it was like in the NIV, Psalm 10, verse 4, has it as no room for God.
No room for God. Interesting.
Yeah, in all his thoughts, there is
No, there is no, I see. Yeah. Yeah, they're trying to interpret that idea, right. So this expression for there is not is used, usually it's used to describe other things where in terms of this location or this time, this thing is not there, as opposed to it doesn't exist at all.
You want to make a sandwich, there is no bread.
Yeah, that's right. So like the heavens declare the glory of God, right, in Psalm 19, and day to day bubbles forth speech, and night to night shows forth knowledge. And the next verse says, there are no words, there is no speech, their voice is not heard. But that doesn't mean there are no words anywhere in the world. It doesn't mean there's no speech anywhere in the world. It means in this context, there are no words and there's no speech. And that seems to be the idea here. This is a practical atheist. This is someone who lives as if God's not going to do anything. God's not going to show up. And that kind of thinking then leads to the wickedness that the rest of the verses go after. So the idea is not that God is not present to do anything and does not care to do anything about what mankind is doing. And behind that is the idea that there's no accountability. And that's a bad, bad, bad way to live. Foolish way to live. So let's go to the visual outline chart and walk our way through this short psalm together. Up at the top, you see there's a purpose statement. David writes prophetic encouragement during a time of national duress, assuring the people that God sees the wickedness of their enemies and will spring to action again in judgment and deliverance. And if you move over to the right, what kind of psalm this is? This is a prophetic meditation with a lament. It's mostly a meditation with a lament on the end by David sometime after the tabernacle was restored in 1003. It is, again, almost identical to Psalm 14. The biggest difference is that the term God is used instead of Yahweh, and the announcement of judgment is a little different as well. Moving over to the far left, we have some headings, and I realize that I left one out, but there's a note about authorization, that this is consigned to the choir director. That is, the choir director is permitted and authorized to assign whatever musicians he wants to this, to have it performed when he chooses fit. It says that it is according to Mahalath, which is maybe a tune name, maybe it's a style of performance, maybe it's an instrument. It's one of those words we just don't know. The reason why your Bible has this Hebrew word is we don't know what it means. So they've left it written as a Hebrew word. We're told that the author is David, and also we're told that it's a maskil. The word maskil is related to the word for wisdom. And either it means that this is a song that gives wisdom, or it may mean that this is a song that requires wisdom or skill from the musicians, because the way that it's been arranged. But the body of the poem begins then in verses 1 to 5. We have a prophetic meditation on the godless. In a way, this meditation is a lament over the wickedness of the world. And it starts off with this prophetic indictment of the wicked. David sounds like a prophet in these verses. And it starts off with an assessment of those who reject divine accountability. The assessment is, it's a fool who thinks this way. It's a fool who thinks God isn't here. God's not going to do anything. That is absolutely foolish. So actually that should say verse 1b, the verse 1a. And then in the second half of verse 1, going down into verse 3, is the divine perspective on the depravity of humanity. There's an examination. Verse 1 continues, they are corrupt, they've committed abominable injustice, there is no one who does good. And God makes an examination of mankind in verse 2. God has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see if there is anyone who understands, who seeks after God. God does see, unlike what the fool says. The fool says God's not here, and the psalm says, oh yes, he is. He's looking too, he sees. He sees. And then the verdict in verse 3 about man's depravity is made. Every one of them has turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Now, these words probably sound familiar to you, not only because they show up in Psalm 14, but because they show up in a famous passage in the New Testament. Who is it who quotes these verses? Paul. Yes, the Apostle Paul, in the book of Romans, quotes these verses in chapter 3, verses 10 to 12. Let's turn over to Romans 3. In the book of Romans, Paul is writing to Christian people who were having a hard time getting along, Jewish and Gentile Christian people. And they're pretty well-informed people, so he writes a big theological letter to them. And part of his reasoning why they ought to get along together, is that, you know what, you Jews and you Gentiles, you really got the same problem. We've all got the same problem. It's sin. It affects all of us. And so Paul has spent chapter 1 talking about how the Gentiles are lost in sin, and he spent a lot of chapter 2 saying that the Jews are lost in sin, and then in chapter 3 is we're all lost in sin. And to prove it, he argues this way in Romans chapter 3, verse 9. What then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. As it is written, there is none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside together. They have become useless. There is none who does good, There is not even one. And then beginning in verse 13, he starts to quote from another psalm, and later on he'll quote from another passage. He strings together a series of Old Testament indictments. And so this psalm, which is going after Israel's enemies, in a sense, Paul says, you know what, this applies to even Israel. All of us are like this. Left to ourselves, we don't pursue God. All of us are contaminated. It doesn't mean that every person is as bad as they can possibly be. There are some people who have magnified their corruption, like the people who say that God's not here. You know that. See, but depravity is something that affects the entirety of the race and every aspect of our being. Before we're touched by grace, every aspect of our being is polluted by sin. It is a work of grace for us to turn away from that and to come to God and to realize that there is a God who is present, there is a God who sees, there is a God who saves and who delivers his people and brings them into newness of life.
1 Corinthians chapter 1 has a verse in it that says, it is his doing
Yes,
that you are in Christ Jesus.
that's right. Yeah. And Paul will go on from Romans 3. You know, this problem is so bad, there's got to be a divine work to bring us to him. Because left to ourselves, we're not going to do it. Some people say, well, I was seeking for God, but usually what that means is I was seeking for God on my own terms, you know. So when we genuinely come to want him and desire him, it's because grace has made that difference within us. But at this point in the psalm, this isn't an offer of salvation. This is the indictment. David is explaining to the Israelites, why are these people doing these awful things? Why do they think they're going to get away with this? Well, they're corrupt. They're blind. They're willfully blind. They're fools. They're powerful. They seem like they're getting away with a lot for a while, but they're not going to get away with it inevitably. There's one last part for the indictment. In verse 4, there's a question. It's an astonishing question. Have the workers of wickedness no knowledge? Don't they know what they're doing? Don't they know God sees? Don't they know they can't get away with anything? Have the workers of wickedness no knowledge, who eat up my people as though they ate bread, and have not called upon God? They just consume us. You know, it might be the image of military troops going from village to village and just wiping out people and kind of like eating up that village and eating up that village. And they're not going in God's strength. They're not doing the Lord's will. They're resting in themselves. Don't they know that they're not going to get away with this? Well, David makes it clear in verse 5 that they're not going to get away with this. There's in verse 5 a prophetic announcement of judgment. Now the they that's mentioned there, they were in great fear. They is talking about the workers of wickedness. There they were in great fear where no fear had been, for God scattered the bones of him who encamped against you. So here are these enemies, they're doing their stuff, they're destroying, they're sending out troops, and all of a sudden the tables turn. And they're terrified. Something has happened. We don't know what it is. We don't know if this is one of the times that God opened up heaven and sent down hailstones. We don't know if it was all of a sudden the troops of Israel were suddenly able to rout them and turn the battle around, but they had been living without fear. They thought they could get away with murder, literally, and suddenly it all turns on them. And the explanation is that God scattered the bones of him who encamped against you. Now, that's a very vivid picture, for not only are they defeated, they are so defeated and annihilated, they don't even get a proper burial. We're not even going to dignify these marauders with a proper burial. We're going to take their broken bodies and spread them out across the field. Not a good way to end. And it ends in verse 5, speaking to God, You put them to shame because God rejected them. There's a disgrace that's brought upon these proud enemies. Now, when did this happen? Again, we don't know. It's the kind of thing that happened again and again as God came to the deliverance of his people. It would happen in the days of Hezekiah, when the mighty army of Assyria with 186,000 troops is besieging Jerusalem, and they're killed overnight by a famine. It's the kind of thing that God did throughout Israel's history, and here it's spoken about in general terms. In this time and this place, there was judgment. There was this dread that the wicked had, and then their defeat was utterly disgraceful. And that kind of thing God did throughout history. And of course, the New Testament, even the Old Testament, tells us that at the end of the age is the ultimate judgment. So there are people nowadays who seem to go through their whole life and they get away with stuff. Criminals, strong men. There are oppressive governments that go on sometimes for centuries. But the Bible encourages us, even if we don't see it in the short run, even if we don't see it in our lifetime, there is an accounting. God sees. And no matter if people think that he doesn't, even if they think that there's no God here to worry about, God sees, and he'll bring it around right. So verse 5 ends the prophetic meditation. And then the psalm ends in verse 6 with a lament, concluding a lament, a heart cry for the end of oppression. There's a prayer in verse 6 at the beginning of it for the God of the tabernacle to deliver Israel on the battlefield. Verse 6, oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion. Well, who is the one who brings deliverance? It's God. God is the one who dwelt within Zion. He made his presence especially known there on the hill of Jerusalem. And it doesn't matter where the battle is, it doesn't matter how far away it is, that he is able in his time to come and bring about deliverance to his people. I think verse 5, by the way, is describing what is going to happen, what had not yet happened, though it's mentioned in the past tense. It's almost as if David had a vision of the victory that was soon to come. So in the beginning of verse 6, he prays for the God of the tabernacle to come to the battlefield and bring help. And then there's confidence in future deliverance. The end of the verse says, when God restores his captive people. Captive doesn't have to mean that they're in the Babylonian exile. It could simply mean that they're being encircled, surrounded by enemies. They're captive in a loose way. Maybe they're besieged. God will restore it. God will turn it around. And this will be a cause for Jacob to rejoice and Israel to be glad. Isn't that interesting? Let Jacob rejoice. Jacob, we've been studying about him. What's his other name? Israel, yeah. So whenever the nation of Israel is called Jacob, it's usually highlighting his weakness. Jacob was the least mature of all the patriarchs, and it took a long time in his life before he really started to live more like he trusted in the Lord. And the Lord gave him a new name as he started to mature. So the nation of Israel is named after him, but sometimes they're named after his old name. And when they're named after his old name, it's highlighting their weakness, their neediness. The needy nation is going to rejoice because God's going to come and make things right. And you know what? That's good news for us because we find ourselves in trouble. We find ourselves in a world that is hostile to biblical values. It's hostile to the gospel. It's hostile to our Christian testimony. And we may have periods of time where it's not bad, where it may be even pretty good, and then there's times where it gets really intense. I think about our brothers and sisters overseas who are in hostile territory. They can draw comfort that the Lord sees, and the Lord is going to make things right. And you, in your trouble, me in my troubles, the Lord sees. The Lord sees. and in His time and in His will, He'll bring about deliverance to His glory and our good.